Okay, so welcome everyone, and thank you for joining the first webinar of CARL's Inclusive Collections series, Indigenous Voices and Library Collections, which has been organized by CARL's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Working Group. I'm Julie Morin, Senior Program Officer at CARL. Unfortunately, live simultaneous translation will not be offered for this session after all due to some technical issues this morning. We will be sharing a translated recording with registrants after the event, and we apologize for the inconvenience. Malheureusement, la traduction simultanée en direct ne sera pas disponible pour cette session en raison d'un problème technique. Au lieu de cela, nous partagerons un enregistrement traduit avec les participants après le webinaire. Et mes excuses pour le dérangement. So I'd like to start by taking a moment to acknowledge that today's panelists and attendees are joining us from the unceded territories of many Indigenous peoples who have lived and worked on this land for millennia and continue to do so today. My home and the CARL office, located here in Ottawa, capital of the country we now know as Canada, are built on unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory. We welcome you to add your own acknowledgements into the chat and to honor and recognize the ongoing contributions of the First Peoples of these lands. I'd also like to take an opportunity to go over the logistics for the session. Participants have been muted upon entry. There will be time for questions at the end, and you're encouraged to type your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Aditi Gupta, CARL Visiting Program Officer for EDI, and Abby Colucci, Open Education and Instructional Design Librarian at the University of Waterloo, are present and will be moderating the Q&A and chat for us. Links to the CARL Code of Conduct have been included at the beginning of the chat thread, and the organizers of this webinar are committed to providing a welcoming, professionally engaging, and safe experience for all. If you have any questions or concerns, please contact Susan Haig, CARL Executive Director, whose contact information has also been listed in the chat. Finally, auto-generated captions have been enabled for this webinar, which is being recorded. Now I'd like to invite our speakers, Ashley and Carleen, to introduce themselves and lead our discussion today. And maybe we can start with Ashley, as she appears first on my screen.
Sure, I was just trying to find the unmute for some reason. It took me a minute. So Tanshi, Ashley Edwards Dishner Karshan, and Michif Dutch P Scottish Nia, Mamichif Femi Kayash, St. Francis Xavier, Manitoba, P Portage the Prairie, Manitoba. So hello everyone, my name is Ashley Edwards. My family is, or I am Métis, Dutch, and Scottish. My Métis ancestors come from St. Francis Xavier in Manitoba and more contemporarily Portage the Prairie. St. Francis Xavier is where my family took scrip. However, I live and work in Burnaby, British Columbia. I'm the Indigenous Initiatives Librarian at Simon Fraser University, based out of the Burnaby campus. And the Burnaby campus is located on Burnaby Mountain, an area known in Squamish-Nim as Thuk-the-Kwai-Kwaitin, which refers to the arbutus trees located both on the mountain I live on or work on and just kind of below the area just below the mountain as well. And it's lovely to be here with everyone.
Thanks, Ashley. And Carleen.
Hi, my name is Carleen Delorier-Lyle. I'm the Information Services Librarian here at Huichua Library, one of many branches of the UBC library system. I was born and raised in the Okanagan, so unceded Syilx territory. I am Anishinaabe, so my family is from Lac Seul First Nation as well as Barons River First Nation. I'm a band member there. My great-great-grandfather was Robert Wesley and came down from the Fort Albany area, so also Swampy Cree, and married Ida Trout in Lac Seul First Nation, and then had my great-grandmother, Emily Wesley, who then married Fred Baptiste from Barons River First Nation, so related to Trouts, Wesleys, as well as the Baptistes from out east. Delorier is my mother's name, and then it's very long and hyphenated. Lyle is from my father's side. So my grandma was adopted to the Lyle family out in the Dryden area, and then moved out to the Okanagan area. So that is how I came to be in the valley there. I moved to the Vancouver area to earn my master's. Started working at Huihua as a student librarian, and I've remained on unceded territories here for about 7 years now, which is pretty wild to think about. Yeah, that's me.
Okay, great. So maybe we can move on to the first question. We have some questions posted on the slides for our speakers. As librarians engage in decolonizing work, especially when it intersects with Indigenous knowledge systems, they may encounter challenges due to lack of training or familiarity. What guidance can we offer to librarians who are new to this area?
Yeah. I'm sure, I know for myself, this is a question I get frequently. I'm assuming for you as well, Carleen, maybe? It's hard to see your face. You're very tiny on my computer screen. And I can share some of my advice, and then I'd love to hear, Carleen, what your advice often is. But my advice to folks is to start learning about the lands and the nations where you're located. I think it's really important to root us in where we're physically located, even though unless you're from one of these nations, it's not where your family's from. And so to learn the history of the land where you are, the impacts of colonization on the land and the nations, and then engage in some critical reflection about who you are and how your family has arrived to Canada and perhaps benefited from colonization. And thinking about that in terms of why this work in your career is important to you. And then moving from there, when I work with faculty, I usually advise them on thinking about how colonization has impacted their area of study. So I would do the same for librarians. So think about the impact of colonization on Indigenous knowledge sharing and recording, and how libraries may have been complicit in the assimilation of Indigenous peoples and knowledge, and as well as appropriation. And epistemicide, and how we have a responsibility to change, which is a lot to start with. So I'll pause and see what Carleen has.
Yeah, I'd say in addition to, sorry, and I'm trying to sit very ergonomic, Ashley. That's why I look so tiny.
It's also my screen's got everybody tiny, so I have my notes on one side.
Trying to be healthy and sit better. Yeah, in addition to learning about, host nation, or I guess if you're on your own territory, it's not really necessary. But my immediate thought, at least from like a UBC context, is if folks have touched base with the Indigenous initiatives at the Center of Teaching and Learning Technology. Now, this is something that is really specific again to UBC, but I'm just also going to add this into the chat so that folks know what I'm talking about here. But my immediate inclination is, does your institution have something similar to this? So the folks from CTLT and DIDG initiatives are mainly geared toward faculty and staff at the campus. And these folks help folks bring in decolonial perspectives or Indigenous perspectives into their pedagogy, into their classrooms, and facilitate that. And they have a really incredible team. So thinking about what professional development already exists, this is a stream that we frequently run into with folks accessing research at Huihua, but sometimes they're not necessarily looking for just a text. They're also looking for folks to help facilitate that learning or unlearning. So I'm also thinking about just the way that we as librarians already look for professional development opportunities. And I like to guide folks to those resources because folks that are willing to present and talk about, much like, Ashley and I here today, we've given permission and consent for our time to talk about, some of the challenges that folks are facing. So I'm looking for that way of either explicit or even, explicit consent, and folks was just saying like, I'm okay to talk about this today, rather than someone just turning to you at a table and, hey, I heard you're Indigenous, so tell me all the things. So there's ways that we can, look at our own patterns of looking for PD and do that work ourselves.
Yeah. I want to add, I think that's a really beautiful answer. And I want to add to it too, is being like, you don't have to do this on your own. So if you, in your library, if you've got some colleagues who are also interested in doing this learning, do it together and form a group. And there's a lot of different resources out there of folks who have offered their time instead of doing what Carleen says and just like coming across an Indigenous person and ask them to teach them all the things. Would be definitely not the way to do it. But working, I've been told by faculty when I bring them together that learning and unlearning and relearning in a community of other people who are doing that work has made a huge difference on their learning as well. So don't feel like you have to do it on your own.
Yeah, and I guess I just didn't want to assume that everyone has something like CTLT either. So my next question is like, if you don't have something like that, is there space within your role to advocate for something like that? So another reason why I'm also putting that into the chat is if folks go, we don't have anything like that. You might be able to find someone if you're not able to really push for that, even getting some other folks to like rally and find solidarity. And these things exist. They are quite successful. We should have something similar.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. If there's no other comments, I think we can go over to our second slide. Traditional publishing houses have previously overlooked Indigenous voices and perspectives. What do you think might be barriers to the inclusion of Indigenous voices in mainstream publishing, and how could these challenges be addressed?
You can tell we have not talked about who's going to answer first for any. Did you want to start, Carly, or do you want me to start?
Well, I don't want to jump too far from this one, because I think what we run into at Huihua isn't a lack of Indigenous creations, right? We have such an abundance. So before I don't want to move us away from the questions. Is there a way that you wanted to directly speak to this one, Ashley?
No, I think I've got a couple of points around thinking about barriers to also education and how we think about knowledge, in the sense that in academia, peer reviewed is really pushed. As well as, like, if you're going to read a book, it should come from an academic publisher, and who gets to publish in those venues and who doesn't, I think is really important in thinking about this question. And if there's folks in publishing listening to this, in thinking about the importance of nurturing relationships with Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers and community members, and thinking, going beyond the academic credentials and understanding who holds that knowledge, while also respecting that there's going to be some times where knowledge is just not going to be available to everyone. I'm skimming my notes. Those are the gist of my notes. If there's anything you wanted to add.
Yeah, I like that you're bringing up the peer review process, because my immediate thought, I guess, again, just growing up in the Valley, it was pretty hard not to come across the Anaukin Center and Thetis books at some point or another in my undergraduate degree. So Thetis Press is Canada's oldest Indigenous owned operated publishing house, right? And Gregory Young was one of my professors in my undergrad. So he's quite influential in this body of work. So he did speak quite a bit about it in class as well, and the importance of, knowledge within texts and what should and shouldn't be published, right? So quick disclaimer, just because he has passed recently, and so just for folks, I'm going to share in the chat a video, but for perhaps cultural reasons you don't want to view that quite yet, is totally fine. I think enough time has passed, but just in case. So it was reviewing the interview where he's talking about the history of Thetis, and he's really highlighting his perspective as an editor and the lengths that they go, or the recommendations that they have within Thetis around assessing traditional knowledge, understanding protocols about what should and shouldn't be shared, and the importance of having contact with the community from which that knowledge comes from, right? So even if we're prioritizing Indigenous authorship within our collections, there's also this peer review process, this editorial process that comes into play. And it's important for us to take into consideration who are the folks that are filtering that knowledge through in that workflow, for lack of a better term, right? And also what is being missed within the publishing process. So for me, I understand that there's been the traditional prioritization of specific perspectives. However, what I'm interested in today is more about folks having a better understanding of what is included in texts, what shouldn't be included in texts, what is made accessible to folks. And he really captures that very well in such a short interview. So a lot of the points I think that he's making could be followed up on with some further research to understand, some of the ethical concerns within that body of work.
Yeah, and if that has intrigued audience and participants, Gregory Younging's book, Elements of Indigenous Style, is one that I recommend everybody read. And like, most people are not going to pick up a style guide to read for fun. The idea of sitting down with APA and reading it cover to cover, just like not something that most people want to do. But Elements of Indigenous Style goes into a lot of those topics in more detail and provides like case studies with other Indigenous and allied scholarship, Indigenous authors and allied scholars, in a really beautiful way. And I know, trying to remember when I attended it, I think it was sometime last month. They're working on a second edition with a member of Gregory's family, and with that blessing, that should be out, I think, next year, an updated version, which is really exciting to see that work and then see how it's being newer topics are coming in. So they talked about how they're going to look at AI and Indigenous topics and knowledge. And I think that's really one of the important pieces in a couple of the questions that we have today to talk about, but just thinking about like who gets to speak for Indigenous peoples and communities, historically and contemporarily. And I think the protocols, I think the notion of knowledge protocols always trips people up in knowing like some knowledge shouldn't be shared by outside of certain groups or at certain seasons. And the idea that not all knowledge is freely accessible and freely available to every person.
Okay, well, that can segue us nicely into our next question, just in the interest of time. And just a note before we go on, Carleen, that for the chat, you do have to have it set to send to everyone. We have sent the 2 documents that you have sent out, but they were just going to panelists and hosts. So if you'd like to chat with everyone, you can click the drop-down link there.
There we go. We're good now. I was wondering, I could see you sharing them again. I'm like, what's happening?
Okay, so how can collection development efforts prioritize works by Indigenous authors and creators?
You want to start? I've started the last.
Mine's pretty short. I was like, just buy them. Just my immediate thought was like, buy them, period. Next question. It was not only purchasing Indigenous perspectives, right, but we could think about, prioritizing places like Thetis Books, other Indigenous press, even if you go to Good Minds, so the folks that were Strong Nations. So really just building an awareness of who are you purchasing from. Those are added layers of ways that we can support work that folks are doing. You could also look at if there's any perceived gaps. We interact here at Huichua with quite a wide variety of research questions, and folks sometimes think that, well, maybe there's nothing for physical education, or if we're thinking in terms of engineering or even math, right? We can all remember these moments where our history teacher was trying to teach us, or sorry, a math teacher, not history, or a math teacher be like, if you have this tree and then it's this tall and you need it to get cut down, how long is it going to go? Whatever, don't build a house there or something, or don't cut the tree down in the way of your house. There's ways that even when we're trying to look at these specific subject areas, there is Indigenous knowledges that can speak to all of these areas. There are real life examples that we can bring in to our work. And so when you're working with folks on the public services side, you see evidence of where folks have these, social perceptions of where there's a gap within the collection. There's really creative ways that we can get folks to even turn to resources that we wouldn't necessarily send them to. For example, folks coming in with a question around education don't necessarily always need to go to the education sections of the branch. We might need to get them to think creatively in other sections of the library in order to fill those gaps. So I'd say that's not necessarily around prioritizing Indigenous authors and creators for the acquisitions process, but more of like a service that we can build in, so that you can even take it one step further, I'd argue, than simply, buying. Let's just buy it all up, buy all these Indigenous perspectives and then call it a day. There's ways that we can mediate access, but also pointing folks to other parts of the branch to create a better experience for folks, for patrons, I think.
Yeah, it's breaking down like what you're describing, the way I'm thinking about it, interpreting it. It's like it's breaking down that idea that only math books can teach about math and only education books can teach about education. But really, that's not how topics work, and that's not how knowledge is shared. And so can we look at other places? Like, what about beating stuff for math? Like, I probably would have done much better in math if somebody was like, let's talk about this in relation to beating something. Which I know I've read some book chapters on that being brought into elementary schools, math education that way, which is really beautiful. And so it's also having that flexibility in being able to think about this. And I want to reiterate the like, just buy stuff. Like, can we buy things and spend some time looking at who are the Indigenous publishers? This is something I've talked to folks I work with about, because sometimes those smaller publishers are not in our big vendors, and so you have to deliberately then be looking for it, because you might not just come across it in your approval slips or whatever everybody else's vendor calls them, and so you can miss things. And I think it can be an act of reconciliation then to prioritize where you're also purchasing things from instead of using our vendors, and supporting the publishers themselves, or the local Indigenous booksellers. So like in Vancouver, where we're based, there's Massey Books and there's Iron Dog Books. Strong Nations is, I think, out of Nanaimo on Vancouver Island. So think about like also supporting local as well. To me, that's part of this collection development and prioritizing Indigenous peoples.
Perfect. So I think we'll move ahead to our next question, which is, what criteria should librarians consider when selecting Indigenous resources for their collections?
I feel like the first question that we always ask at this branch is the authorship identity. So is the individual Indigenous first and foremost? If they're not, are there ways that we can read the introduction, or even, we're all familiar with the research process. So were Indigenous community members included in the research method as well? Yeah, is the very first question that we ask. Also looking at the author's relationship to the content within the text. So even if someone is Indigenous, right, then who are they writing about? So me as an Anishinaabe person wouldn't feel comfortable to all of a sudden start writing about Musqueam culture. In fact, I think it would take all of a day before someone called me out on it at absolute most to tell me that I should stay in my lane. Um, right? So there's those criteria. And lastly, before I pass it, I guess, over to Ashley or hear your thoughts, is there's a resource that I use for so many different purposes, but this was created by Kayla Larson originally for a pharmacy class. And she's taken anything that's like pharmacy oriented context for this out of it and made it so that folks can use it for their own research purposes. So if folks are unsure of whether a book is good or bad, or a resource is good or bad, it's not within my role to tell you that. I think it's inappropriate, but it is totally appropriate for me to give you some criteria or questions that you can ask yourself in order to make your own decisions about whether or not you trust what's being stated in the resource. So there's 4 areas that she's really delved into questions that folks can ask themselves about a resource. And it is like a beautiful checklist. Obviously, it's more complicated and complex than that, but it's a really good foundation to get folks started on assessment.
Mm-hmm. And we love checklists in libraries. I was just going to add, I think like your comment about like being Anishinaabe and not writing about Musqueam like resonates so much in thinking about my work at SFU and being Indigenous, but not from one of the nations that SFU is located on. But I was chatting this morning with someone kind of about something similar and about like who gets to write and who gets to share. And we started talking about Pauline Johnson's work that she did with Squamish and wondering about like we want to now check her works, but also like did she acknowledge the permission to be able to share those works, which I think is interesting in relation to a project that may or may not happen. We're still in the very beginning stages of talking about it here, where someone talking about carvings and bringing carvings into the library, and as well as teachings and stories that go along with that. And it was told to me that then that would be my responsibility to make sure that those teachings, while sitting with a carver and listening to it, were accessible then to folks coming in to see the piece. And so I was like, oh, so not me writing about the nation, but the carver said that would be my responsibility in that kind of project, is making sure that that knowledge can be shared out as it's shared with me. So there's these interesting lines of blurriness, I think. And I think to your point, it's important then to look in the introduction to make sure that the author has stated that and stated this is being shared with permission, or the community has asked me to do this. And so this is why I'm doing it. For both like Indigenous people outside of that community, but also allied scholarship. So if it's a non-Indigenous scholar who has really strong connections to the community, are they explicitly saying that they're allowed to share that and that it's being shared with permission? And even sometimes who gave them that permission, I think is really important.
Yeah, because I mean, like what you're describing, it almost sounds like you've been within your work with this carver, they've assigned you like a role as witness. Yeah, yeah. So there's specific ways that
Yeah.
that you like have to.
Yeah, if the project's just in the conversation stages, so it might not actually come to fruition, but he was very clear right away that like, if this happened this way, this is what you need to do. And I was like, okay, yeah, then I need to also learn that protocol better and being able to carry that out to the best of my responsibility and knowledge. So there's interesting things that way, which is exciting, but also a lot of responsibility for the person, for
That's what I was
both of
gonna say,
us.
is that that's quite the responsibility there. Not to freak you out. Oh my.
We can talk about that later. The last thing I want to throw out here in terms of thinking about criteria, and maybe Kayla's gone through this in her document, which I haven't looked at in detail yet, but I've looked at your document that you've created before for children's literature, which is phenomenal. And what I advise a sessional in the Langara Tech program, and when I work with students, one of the things me and my co-teacher always stress to students is making sure that you get representation across the diversity, right? So we're using the word Indigenous, and we didn't unpack that for our participants, but like Indigenous refers to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. So if you're collecting only First Nation voices, you're erasing Métis and Inuit experiences. Same with if you're only looking at straight authors, you're missing a wealth of information and knowledge. Male, female, and two-spirit all need to be, and transgender all need to be represented in the collection. And that takes work. And those pieces, like the identity, gender, and sexuality, are not necessarily going to be in a record's metadata. And so it takes a bit of research sometimes to find that. But I think it's important to have that breadth of voices in a collection.
Perfect. So I think we'll go to our next slide and look a little bit broader at how can collection development policies and practices be adapted to intentionally include Indigenous perspectives, cultural materials, and knowledge systems.
I think we've talked about some of this, hey, Carlene, in terms of like learning about protocols and where things are being published. We're piloting in SFU library about for certain items not purchasing through our vendor, but purchasing through a local Indigenous owned bookstore, which is I think a really great switch from a policy of like we have to purchase through the vendor. But I also want to like, I'm really interested in collection development. How can we bring non-text-based materials into a library? Because often if you ask students, right, what do you think about the library? They're going to tell you that it's a quiet place and that you can go and get books. And both of those are mostly true. But there's a lot of knowledge that's missed then. And I'm really interested in how can libraries uplift Indigenous knowledges in ways that make sense for the knowledge itself and the community itself. And that's, yeah, so in my space in SFU library, we've got Coast Salish weavings and we have Coast Salish art, and I'm working on a loanable art collection to come into this space as well, which will be really, I think really exciting when we get there, hopefully later this year. And yeah, to learn how the communities around you or Indigenous communities more broadly. I keep wanting to say wrote down, but I don't mean wrote down. I also mean like recorded knowledge and shared knowledge. And how can libraries be inclusive of that?
Yeah, yesterday when we were doing our practice run, I got distracted the most when I was, sitting with this question. And I think it's because I assume that everyone else's assumption is that in order to have Indigenous perspectives in your collection, you then see them within the resources, right? So Indigenous authors, musicians, directors, artists, etc. And I'm like, no, I think that we could take that one step further to how about a more accurate depiction of, even a nation's sovereignty over their information, what they want in a collection is actually like the things that we're not seeing. So what does it look like when we've actually, it's one thing to acquire, but what does it look like when they say like, this should not be here? Even if a resource is, and we've run into this a lot, is even if a resource has hundreds of copies across the world, and there's nothing that we can do about peeling that back, the community could say, in the nation, we didn't give permission in the first place for this to be out, but it is now. knowing that a lot of folks will come to Huihua and they're thinking this is a vetted, because we do go through a vetting process. This is where I'm going to surface the majority of of that information, right? And so then we facilitate access that is not ethical based off of the things that we've been told from the community and the nation from which that, knowledge belongs. So even when they say we don't want that out there, or this should be accessible to only us, or we're okay to have it at your branch and actually another special collection. It's the thing sometimes that we don't see on the shelf that is perhaps a better representation of an accurate perspective in there. And even for cultural materials, I mean, I think about the textual, in addition to, something like a weaving, right? Moa's down the road from us. They have a better capacity. They have a great relationship with Muslim community members. So sometimes it's not even necessarily things that you don't have to have it all in order to have a great representation of Indigenous perspectives, right? And gosh, what was the last thing that I was gonna say on this one is there's at one point in time, we have folks coming through and they'll say, well, actually, we're revitalizing this practice. And even though this research was extractive in nature at the time, we do require this piece in order for us to, revitalize XYZ. And they said, I wasn't here, but they were talking to Kayla and they said, like, could you actually please keep a copy of this? So even this automatic assumption that if someone needs to be Indigenous, I mean, they had just flagged us, I'd really like for you to keep a copy so that we can come back. And that's what we want, is we want folks coming back into the branch and us understanding that this is something that they've explicitly asked for us to keep. So it's interesting because in that example, it's not even an Indigenous author in order to have, a relevant collection for these folks.
I think that's really beautiful and powerful in thinking about and I see narrative sovereignty. It's Jesse Wente talks about that in his book around narrative sovereignty and the right to like your own stories and who gets to share them. It kind of goes back to what we were talking about in a previous question around Gregory Younging's work and like with publishing and editing and the protocols, knowledge protocols. And I think it's Marie Baptiste writes a lot about knowledge protocols. And it comes down to community by community, right? And so like I'm thinking I've got some books. I think you and I have talked about this before. I've got some books that a student has shared with me that has powerful ceremonial knowledge in them that should have never been taken out of community. They were published in like the early 1900s. What do we do with them now? They're in public domain. They're everywhere, potentially even digital at this point, I think, right? Because public domain stuff. And so what do we do with that? And it's a community that's not local to here. So I need to make connections with that community to be able to say, what would you like us to do with this work and these materials? And so one of the things that we're working on or that we're talking about in my library is this idea of a policy and how policies are like, you have to do things this way. But the policy needs to be different for each instance, sort of in these cases.
Sorry, don't mean to cut you off. We do have 2 questions left before we open it up to Q&A. So we're just going to try to get through those as well. What ethical considerations should guide collection development partnerships with Indigenous knowledge holders?
Happy to rip through this one, actually. Just for time's sake. Yeah, I was seeing an information source or even a data set is something that isn't separated from community, right? So the easiest way for me to think about ethics in a nutshell is to really think about something as alive, right? Because even though obviously I can't feed or water this, it's not a baby or a child, but it does have real world impacts on people. And the information that's in it, the knowledge is, even if it's a data set, is representative of the tie that it has to folks that are alive and existing today. So it's a really easy framework for me, or at least it gives me an easy foundation to think about what type of research am I helping and facilitating today that is going to have impact? And yeah, go ahead, Ashley, take it away.
I don't know if I have much to add to that. I think the only, I have in my notes OCAP and the R's and thinking about what is given back to the community, whether it's a local community outside of your institution or internally to the institution if you're working with Indigenous researchers and students. What's given back and what I think this is part of my answer for the next question, but thinking about like who gets to access that data today and in the future. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe we'll jump into that next question since we're transitioning there anyways. I see we already have one question in the Q&A. How can libraries collaborate with Indigenous communities to co-create collections that authentically represent their cultural heritage and contemporary contributions?
Yeah, I can start because I think it picks up on what I was just trying to say. And so when I read this question, my first thought went to like open education resources and libraries creating them with communities. And I don't know, Carlene, you might have had a different interpretation, but that's where my brain went. And my first response is to that kind of question is like, well, why are we doing it? So is it something that the library has initiated, or is it something that a community has come to the university, the college, the person they know in that place to say, hey, can we partner on this project? And I think there's similar pathways into that, but a little bit different. So if it's the library doing it, my first question is always, what's the purpose and why? Like, so why are you instigating that project? And is it a priority for that community? Because it might not be. Particularly, I'm thinking in BC, where a lot of the communities are quite small and will have differing priorities than the libraries. I'm touching on Carlene's conversation around data, like where is it being stored and who has access to it during that? So, and data means so many different things. So it could be the conversations, the transcripts, the numerical, I can't even say the word properly. Anything that comes out of that though, any writing, needs to be shared with the community, and the community needs to have the ability to say no at any point, that they don't want to continue, that they don't want something published. Yeah, like 100% involvement. They need to be attributed as authors, as co-creators, which I think is missed in a lot of the historic materials about Indigenous people. Yeah, so giving a lot of agency and autonomy to the community.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I have to add to this one was my immediate thought was the same thing as what you just said around what's the purpose, but also like who's really pushing for this. There's a huge difference between someone coming forward and saying like, listen, we want to work on this project, we want to collaborate, versus us, understanding what value we bring as librarians and archivists and all that to community and whatever language revitalization or historical research, whatever. Even though we know our value, sometimes it's not the right time. It's not a priority right now. And when we push, we can really negatively impact relationship building. It's just folks are simply not ready or wanting to do that at this time. And I find it really difficult when we see as a nation, folks really wanting to pick up, TRC work and UNDRIP, and then we see these positions being generated around this cultural work. And the best people to fill those positions are Indigenous folks. And if the institution is ready and the federal government is ready and the nation is, nation states ready, that doesn't necessarily mean that, communities and Indigenous nations are at that. They're not like, I just don't care right now. And the downside of that is the folks that step into these roles. So if your ideal candidate is an Indigenous librarian coming in, then how are we setting up our colleagues Because if people have that within their JD and that's wonderful, then how are people being supported? So I think that that comes down to like a managerial level, is really looking at how do you support professionals in that area. Being cognizant of that is really important, I think.
Well, thank you both. And I think if there's no further comments, I'll pass it over to my colleague Aditi so that we can hop into the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Carleen and Ashley. I really learned a lot today. I'm going to ask if folks can please use the Q&A to ask questions, but also chat if you would like to. And we'd also like to remind you to pause for a few minutes before you ask your questions to assess whether there are comments or questions and whether they can be asked perhaps online or through email, or can be shared with the community or not. I think we do have a question in the Q&A, so I'm going to go directly to it. The question is, how do you handle controversial books by and about Indigenous peoples that are challenged?
We've got critical Indigenous literacy kids, so if it's a children's picture book, we deal with that. We use the same criteria to assess not picture books as well. So if it's something that, you know, we've pulled, so like, what is this doing on the shelf? We've even had other colleagues come in. Ryan Moran was here and was like, what is this? These things happen in all branches. It depends. If it's a kid's book, goes into the crit lit. If it's something that's been flagged from the community, we have taken them from the shelves. The other branches are giving them to us. We keep them in here. We figure out access protocol with them and even some wording on that one. Things can get a little bit trickier when we are delving into fraudulent claims to Indigenous identity and authorship right now. And as a team, we discuss that quite a bit. We don't know yet. And I don't think that it's something that we have to have conversations about just specifically at Huiwa. We're really lucky to have 3 of us here that can speak to that personally, but it's a conversation I think that we're wanting to have, obviously, with our folks like Ashley, right?
Yeah.
Answers.
I don't think I haven't directly had to respond to any of any concerns like that. I do know like SFU has a pretty strong policy around collections, and so it would get bumped up. But I am within the collection I take care of at SFU. I am having some of the same concerns that you just outlined around identity, in terms of I was looking up a couple of titles, and the editors doing some of my own research and finding out that some of the an editor in a collected work, it has now had their identity questioned, and the question then for me becomes, what do I do with the volume? And do I remove it? Do I keep it with a note? What does it indicate to the Indigenous authors that are in the collection? There's a lot of things that way. Yeah, I think it's sort of a title by title, case by case situation. Like, policy is great until you start looking at the materials itself.
Thanks, Carleen and Ashley. I'm just wondering if folks have other questions. I have a question of my own that I was thinking about as I came in this morning, and it was to do with the CAPL conference that I heard the recordings for, and Ashley, you were there presenting. I heard Deborah Lee talk about the fact that she had done this project with making collections accessible to Indigenous communities. And I'm wondering if you had any thoughts about that, or if you wanted to shed some light about that. Like, I mean, if you haven't done it, I was just listening to what Deborah had said, and I was thinking about it on my way in this morning. But anything that you both have information about?
So the project that you're talking about, so Deborah was the Indigenous Knowledge Coordinator for COPL, and we presented at CAPL. Just the acronyms are too similar sometimes for my brain. as part of the Indigenous Knowledge Standing Committee. And so Deborah, when she was in that role, had worked on a project called First Voices First. And so she worked with Emerald to have their resources freely available, I'm pretty sure freely available, to Indigenous organizations and communities. I believe particularly in northern Manitoba and Saskatchewan, but I could be misremembering the details, so don't quote me on that, please. And I think that projects like that are really important because if academic publishing is often behind a paywall, right? So to do the research, people need to pay to access the articles that are being written by scholars who are often paid by institutions to do the research. And so I think there's a disconnect over who gets to access information and who doesn't. And it creates a very exclusionary way of finding information. And so I think that that project is really groundbreaking and a beautiful project. I know in British Columbia, there's a collective of universities and post-secondary institutions who run the Community Scholars Program that does something very similar for nonprofits. And so I personally would be interested in seeing something similar like that for Indigenous communities and community organizations to be able to give back to community all the knowledge that is being sometimes written about them or with them, but also on topics that could impact them.
At the BC level, at least, there is a First Nations interest group. It's one of the sections that's underneath BC Library Association. And they haven't been active from what I can tell based off their minutes. Nothing's happened since about 2015. But within this, part of their mission is to share knowledge on aspects of information professional relevant to Aboriginal interests expressed by Aboriginal peoples, developing relationships, and to encourage support for Indigenous folks coming into the profession. But I love what you're talking about, Ashley, around making accessible information. And I think that there are definitely ways that, folks can, again, this is a lot of work. It's not something that we're going to be able to easily do. And as we've expressed before, it does take time and, community buy-in, or like we're ready to build this relationship. So I think that there are groups, as collectives that we can come together and start to think about how we can do this work, because it's not something that can be done outside of a group and collaborative effort.
No, but as you're talking about that, I'm like, well, consortia could maybe include this in strategic planning as part of their reconciliation work, right? In thinking about that, maybe as you're negotiating licenses for all of us in bigger institutions, maybe negotiate one or two as well for Indigenous communities and nonprofits and organizations.
Yeah.
I can see a world of possibilities. If there are any publishers or anybody listening in. But I'm going to pass it back to Julie now, just because I know we're a little bit out of time, or we're getting close to a cutoff time for Q&A. So if there are no more questions, I will pass it back to Julie.
Thanks, Aditi. So just to say really quick, on behalf of CARL, I'd like to thank our presenters, Ashley and Carleen, for leading this great discussion, Aditi and Abby for moderating the Q&A and the chat, and all of our participants for attending. So apologies that we were not able to have the simultaneous translation this time, but I think other than that, it was a great session. We ask that you please keep an eye out for upcoming webinars in this series, and we hope to see you again soon. So thanks, everybody, and I hope you have a good rest of your week.